All right, as introduced, my name is Fletcher Warren, and I wrote this paper for my senior seminar in history last spring with Chris Garrett's. So, a long way from Minneapolis, Minnesotans in the Spanish Civil War. Most people don't even know the Spanish Civil War happened, let alone that Americans fought in it. So, really the issue is, why did I choose this topic? There were a couple things when I approached senior sem that I wanted to accomplish. First was, I wanted to do European subjects, but I also wanted to do a lot of extensive archival research. And those two things don't often go together because, as an American, it's hard to find European sources in America, let alone sources that I can use given the language skills that I have. So, this research really built on a previous paper that I had done about the Spanish Civil War, in which I encountered something called the Lincoln Brigade, which I didn't know anything about. The Lincoln Brigade were a group of 3,500 Americans who defied their government and went to Spain to fight against Franco during the Spanish Civil War, which was between 1936 and 1939. The story actually of how I really thought this was a viable topic is kind of interesting. I was sort of brainstorming and trying to figure out, if there are any sources available for this. And my mom actually was sitting up there. I just started Googling, and she just typed in, I think, Minnesota Spanish Civil War Lincoln Brigade. And the first thing that popped up is actually right here. It's a collection aid for the Minnesota Historical Society of the papers of Clarence Forrester. This is right here. A member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, a group of 2,700 American volunteers, fought in the Spanish Civil War for the Loyalist government against military insurgency led by Franco. So I thought, this is perfect. Here's my topic. So my central question that I really wanted to focus on was, why did these men defy their government, cross an ocean, and fight for people with whom they really had no affiliation prior to this, and die for them? Because half of the 60 Minnesotans who went, in fact, ended up dying in Spain. I began my research with the database of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive, which is a really great organization in New York. I just started searching for Minnesota in their field and obtained the results, and I went through those and weeded out some people who I felt weren't really Minnesotan or well, it's kind of a definitional issue, because some people were born in Minnesota and then moved, and others were born elsewhere and then grew up in Minnesota, so I had to figure out exactly what I meant by Minnesota. So I ended up with a list of 60 people, which I think are arguably Minnesotans. The next thing I went to was book indices, and this is really where Click and Bethel and ILL was immensely helpful, because I requested just about everything I could find, went through the indexes of everything looking for my listed names, and was able to find a decent amount of material. But what really helped me in this project was the archive. And I went to three archives, or used three archives in this process. First is the IHRC at the University of Minnesota. This was a great archive, and actually I used three, and my paper covered three sort of main characters that followed their stories primarily. So, ironically enough, each one of those three came from one of the different archives. So, for the IHRC, I found material related to George Zlatovsky, who was a Ukrainian immigrant to Duluth. He was born in 1910, rather. The second is the Minnesota Historical Society, and this, as I've already mentioned, was where I found Clarence Forrester's papers. I'll talk about Forrester later a little bit. And the third, I wasn't able to actually go to New York, but I was able to use their distance research services, which are really quite excellent. And here is where I found the material for Ben Gardner, who was another Ukrainian born in Odessa in 1907, and immigrated to Duluth in 1910. And here's me in New York over Christmas. Unfortunately, it was closed for Christmas break, so I was not able to get it. Someday. So I'll go through a brief summary of my findings, why they went. Number one, they lived difficult lives. It's hard to overemphasize just how much the Depression played into the experiences of these men. The modal age was 30, which meant, or the modal age was 30 in 1937, which meant at the beginning of the Depression they were in their early 20s, trying to start out, with jobs which suddenly disappeared. So really their lives were shaped by the experience of hardship. And from this, they really developed an anger towards injustice. To tell a number of stories, one of them that really stuck out to me was Zlatovsky, who was working in Duluth among the labor organizations, and he was almost beaten by a group of company thugs that had been hired to break up a protest, and in fact his cousin was beaten to death in that same protest. So this is the kind of experience that these men had. So the other thing that arises from this is that they really had no reason to stay. There were no jobs, most of them did not have families, very few prospects here. A perfect example of this is Clarence Forrester, the man whose papers wrote the History Center here. Forrester was born in 1915 in Alfred, North Dakota, which I was actually able to find some pictures of. Some people allege it's a ghost town, others say, no, it's not. There are 10 people living there. So take that as you will. But this is Alfred today. Clarence grew up there, and his father died when he was young. His mother worked as a restaurateur, wasn't very successful. At the age of 13, he had to go into farming. His master, and I say master because it really almost was a slave-type relationship, very harsh, beat him. In 1930, at the age of 15, he ran away to Minneapolis, and the way he got there, which again illustrates the poverty and desperation he might face, was to ride underneath the rails or underneath the car of a railroad car. And I thought, I got this from an oral history that he gave, and I thought, how does one ride underneath a carriage? And so I started Googling, how one would do this. And apparently there are these stringer beams that go underneath the car to sort of strengthen it, and they were able to just lie on top of those. And about 600-mile journey from Alfred to Minneapolis. This then, once he arrived in Minneapolis, is where he lived. This is Gately Park, which is the current location of the Minneapolis Public Library. In the 30s, this was a place for drifters, homeless, those seeking jobs. They all started coming out and essentially lived. Farmers market at that point was nearby. Clarence talks about us stealing apples because he didn't have any food to eat. The next major component of why they went is they were idealists, dreamers, and utopians. And they were this from a result of their experiences. They dreamt of a better world because of what they had experienced, but also as a basic component of their outlooks. I say this because most of the men that I studied, their family, their friends, all remembered them as these dreamers and utopians who were always searching for a better world. So I think it was not only formed from their experience, but also just based out of their character as well. But I think really the central piece here is their political commitments, because 65% of them were communists, which is quite interesting, and I thought this was really fun because this is Minneapolis, and I want you to think about active communists here. So, and I say 65%, but I don't know the political affiliation of 33 of them. There's just no information. So it could be a lot higher. Nationally, the volunteer experience, certainly I think about 75 to 80% is the usual figure given. So really the question for us is why? At this point, in the 30s, the excesses of Stalinism hadn't really come out yet, particularly in America. And so communism was still viewed very much, and the Soviet Union by extension as sort of the representative of communism, was viewed as being on the side of justice. And men looked at the injustice of American society, the labor issues it experienced, discrimination against minorities, and they saw communism as a sort of this aspirational ideology. And this is actually from the History Center as well. It's the platform for the 1938 election in Minnesota. And you can see, for jobs, security, democracy, and peace, this is the kind of rhetoric used. You can see what I'm looking at. They were also involved in these domestic battles, which really strengthened their radical resolve. This one is a bill in support of the 1934 trucker strike, which truckers in the coal industry challenged the hegemony of the Minneapolis coal industries. They had locked down labor for really since World War I. They had broken the backs of the unions, and weren't treating employees very well. And so the strike arose in order to try to correct some of those issues. So a number of the men were actually involved in the strike. So, as a consequence, they threw themselves into the good fight. One man, George Slotowski, was a communist organizer in Duluth, and he went around the country on a tour seeking to raise money in defense of the Scottsboro Boys, who were black men who were almost certainly accused falsely of raping this woman and put on trial for that. Another example is Slotowski. Another example is Ben Gardner, which I don't have a picture of. But he organized hunger strikes and marches in Duluth. This is, I think, 1931 in Duluth. So, still, they went to Spain with surprising ease, and I think one really strong explanation for this is this concept of the united global one front. this is really something rising out of communist ideology at the time, because the Soviet Union had cast sort of leftist struggles across the world as part of the global struggle against capitalism. And so these men really saw their fight connected to the world revolutionary struggle. And I mean, to be fair, there's really little difference between being beaten to death in Duluth and being shot, in Zaragoza in Spain. So you can kind of see why this really wasn't as big a deal for them, because they had experienced such violence in America. But even for the non-communists, of which there were a few who were very clear they weren't communists, they were what they called anti-fascists. They were still influenced by communism, because anti-fascism fundamentally was a sort of ideology developed by what's known as the Popular Front period, which ran from 1933 through 1938 or so. And in 1933, what happens in January of the year? Hitler comes to power. Fascists really scare communists, and so Stalin and the Comintern and all those groups set in motion around the world opposition to fascism. And so this gets linked up with other leftist causes. Two examples of this. Clarence Forster was one of those avowedly non-communist, anti-fascist people. And what he talked about was that really galvanizing for him in going to Spain was hearing this report on the radio of the Italian fascist Air Force bombing Guernica. And I just have a picture here of some Italian troops with their bombs. And this was really the first time that this kind of level of destruction had been wrought against the civilian population. He thought it was just appalling. And another story really illustrating the attraction of communism, even for non-communists, as sort of an aspirational language, comes from this man named Waino Palin, who was involved in the sinking of the ship. They had to sneak into Spain because our government would not allow them to go. Passports were stamped invalid for Spain. So most of them went to France and then either sunk across the border on land or sailed through the Mediterranean. He was on board the ship with about 200 other Lincoln Brigade volunteers from around the world. There were 50 countries involved in this. And the ship was torpedoed by an Italian sub. So the ship goes down, there are hundreds of men floating around in the water. And what do? The communists all start singing the International, which is sort of the communist anthem. And he said it was in just dozens of different languages because he'd gone from all over the world. So that sort of solidarity really appealed to these people. Now I want to just sort of tell three stories about the research process, about some of the findings, which I think are really fun. The first is the story of finding Baco. At the Minnesota Historical Society, among the papers of Clarence Forster, I found this photo. And on the back, it said Glenn Lindforce. Well, Lindforce sounded familiar. I looked at my notes. Baco Lindforce. This must be his son. So I went on white pages and started searching to see if there are any Glenn Lindforce still living. In fact, I found two in Minnesota. So I wrote up a letter and sent it off to both addresses, and a couple weeks later, I got a phone call. I was actually able to arrange to meet with Glenn and talk about his dad and look at some of the material that he had. He had a number of photos. This is one. This is dad, I think, after Spain. Here's another one that he had. This is Langston Hughes, the famed poet of the Harlem Renaissance. This is, what was his name? Edwin Rolfe, who was another sort of famous poet within the labor movement. And then this picture, that's Ernest Hemingway, who was in Spain for a while. So, Baco met Hemingway as well as Clarence. Baco and Clarence were friends. They were stationed at the same point in Spain. And so they met these kinds of famous people and took pictures of them. I think it's really funny. And one story in particular from Baco and Clarence about Hemingway is Hemingway got them a keg of beer, which was a really rare commodity that worked in Spain. Except no one in the unit actually knew how to tap a keg of beer, except Clarence. So Clarence was the one who tapped Hemingway's keg of beer for the rest of them to enjoy. Another fun story which really illustrates the ideological nature of a lot of the scholarship about this topic is the redaction of Ben Gardner's letters. Ben Gardner's letters I had obtained from the Tammet Library, but unfortunately I only found this out after I had written most of the papers, so I need to do some revisions on that. This book by Carrie Nelson is a collection of original sources, and in it she has a couple of Gardner's letters. They're not the ones that I have, they're very different. And the reason why is because, well, actually first, I'll give an excerpt For the first time in my life, I felt that it is not capitalist property I'm guarding, as I did the National Guard, but the property of the workers, the people of Spain. It's a fairly ideological statement. My version, from Cameraman, says this. It's a very different statement. The reason why is because the handwritten letters, which are the basis of the Carey book, are deposited at Berkeley. In 1990, Gardner's wife transcribed the letters and donated them to Cameraman. But 54 years after the fact, she still felt the need to redact these. That's very interesting. I guess I should say, this is the same wife that Gardner decided not to inform before volunteering. He wrote her from the ship with probably more optimism. Quote, I felt I had to decide one way or the other, and I also knew that you probably would have agreed with me that I had to go. So it seemed to work out because they stayed married until his death in 1944 in World War II. The third story is Zlatovsky, George Zlatovsky, the man I mentioned earlier, born in Odessa, or in Ukraine in 1910, emigrated to Duluth in 1921. I say Zlatovsky the hero because he wrote this sort of book. It's an unpublished manuscript at the Immigration Research and History Center, titled The Anti-Hero, an Anti-Hero of Our Times. It's a very grandiose title for a very grandiose work. But it's fantastic. It's about 120 pages long, and it's a really rich and wonderful source. There's Zlatovsky again. And to be perfectly honest, there's not a whole lot of the story here, except I just wanted to bring this up because of this woman, Julia Child. In one of probably the most bizarre instances in this research, George Zlatovsky and Julia Child are connected because after the war, Zlatovsky married Jane Foster, who worked at the Office of Strategic Services with Julia Child, who incidentally, while not being a communist, was very much involved in sort of leftist circles in the 1930s and 40s. In 1957, Zlatovsky and his wife were accused of leaking sensitive information to the Soviets and fled to France. They both denied the accusations vehemently. So that's a very strange story, unless, of course, maybe it's the story of a Chinese immigrant alumnus of the University of Minnesota who was involved in putting on working class theater as part of Duluth's Little Theater movement in the 30s. Bizarre stuff. If you're interested in reading more about Julia Child and Zlatovsky, here's the book it's from. So going forward, when I started this research, it really was for reasonably utilitarian means, or reasons. I wanted to do something with European material, I wanted to do something with local sources. And so this fit the bill. But as I went through, these people really came to mean a lot more to me. They're very admirable. They had a vision and they acted upon it. And I think that's really, really inspiring. And I think it also helped meeting Glenn Lindfors and getting us personal touch as well. And I guess the second reason this means so much to me is that it's such a wonderfully bizarre, weird, convoluted world. This is Minneapolis, the Minneapolis that we know, and it's really only about 90 years ago. But it's a place where communists run for mayors, where people are beaten to death in the streets, where unions and company thugs clash with brickbats in the streets. It's a bizarre and fascinating world. And it's one I really had no idea existed before I started this research. So going forward, I do want to continue this project as well because there are hundreds of unused sources that I didn't have time to get to. Among them are just simply newspapers. I mean, the period of like 1930 to 1939, or the Minneapolis Star, I can't remember what the Pioneer Press used to be called, but in all the Minnesota dailies, I didn't look at those at all because they're not digitized. They're only on microfilm down at the Historical Center or at the Minneapolis Public Library. So it just wasn't time efficient to look at those sources. Second is the broadsheets. These are sort of semi-regularly published radical papers, and these also present an issue because a lot of them are in other languages, like Finnish or Yiddish. I mean, if you know someone who can teach me Yiddish, come talk to me. But I actually tried to use this book because it was written, it's called Our Boys in Spain. It was written by, I think, the Finnish Workers' Party of Minnesota or something. And it was basically a survey of the different American Finns who were over in Spain. And I didn't really talk about this, but racially, I think a full third of the Minnesota volunteers are Finnish. It's a very strong left-wing community here. And a lot of volunteers came out of that. Clarence Forrester's brother worked in Duluth as the publisher of one of these radical newspapers. But they're unfinished, so Google Translate was able to help me a little bit, and I actually was able to get some pretty valuable information out of this book, but ultimately, I think you have to know the language a lot better than that, really, to mine what's there. And then the Tamiment library, I was only able to use as much of the distance resources as my money allowed, because it does cost. So I'd love to get there and look at the other collections that they have, because they have files on almost every one of the Minnesota volunteers. And some of them are very small, probably just a folder of newspaper clippings and things like that. But there are other oral histories that I never got to, which were recorded in the 80s and 90s. So those are really valuable sources. And then there are other local archives, local historical society, particularly up north. It's a lot of these and came out of the logging communities, the shipping in Duluth, the port authority kinds of positions. They were laborers and truck drivers, and so their records, if they exist, are probably located up in Cook County and the northern areas of Minnesota. And then there are new avenues. I actually excerpted a chapter from this Citizen Revisions and submitted it to the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade last summer, and it got published. And in the process of that, I've been getting pretty regular emails from these people who come out of the woodwork saying, I know this guy who knew one of the volunteers when he came back. You should give him a call. Or, that was my uncle, or my grandfather was this person. So I've had all sorts of new information and new leads. One particular thing I can mention is a lot of the addresses listed in the ALDA database were the same location in Duluth. And I'm really sure what to make of that. These are the password records, by the way, these addresses. But one of these emails revealed to me that, in fact, this address was a hotel, the Lennox Hotel in Duluth, which is demolished in the 50s. But it was a popular lodging for these workers who were sort of itinerant and would, take jobs as they came, go up into the forest and do some logging, and then work in the dockyards. So this is where they lived, and that's why a lot of these addresses come from that particular location. So all sorts of new leads like that I'd really like to extend. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so open it up.
When you were able to track down the son of Baker, right?
Yep.
Did you sense any communist movements?
No, I did ask him that actually. He said after the war, a lot of these men faced a lot of persecution when he came home. The Smith Act had this, Fletcher Warren said earlier, she would attest to cause a lot of problems after the war for communist sympathizers. Very quickly they entered into the McCarthy era. So a lot of these people, they go particularly kind of underground. And I think particularly in 1953 when Stalin died and all of that was revealed and Khrushchev went before the Soviet Congress and revealed a lot of the atrocities that had been happening publicly. That really was a shattering moment for a lot of these people and sort of drove them away from the communist left. Most of them remained fairly leftist for the rest of their lives. I think Glenn said he was Democrat, but to what extent that counts, I'm not sure.
How did they feel about Franco staying in power for so long, say afterwards?
Yeah.
I think he died in the 70s.
Yeah, it was 1974, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a point of huge contention. In fact, once they got back, they set up the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, sort of volunteer association, kind of like the VA, or I should say American Legion. And one of the big things that organization did was, one, it fought the Smith Act in court. And two, it did everything it could to get the American government, to oppose Franco, which we had absolutely no interest in doing. Strategic partner, lots of mineral resources, Nazism's gone, we don't really care, we're in the Cold War now, and Franco doesn't seem to be particularly affiliated with the communists, a little wonder. So he was a partner that we maintained for a long time, and this organization, and a lot of these people individually were continually very bitter about that. I found letters written in the 60s, 70s, 80s in newspapers saying, why are we still supporting this man, this brutal dictator, stealing all these people? but obviously it was a
You mentioned that one of them came back and fought in World War II.
Yes.
Okay. So, okay, they had kind of illegally gone into Spain. How did that all work out in terms
Yes.
of being accepted for service for World War II?
Sure. So the war was fought from 1936 to 1939. And in 1937, because I guess I should back a little bit to say the Spanish Civil War is unique in the amount of international intervention it engendered. The Soviet Union, Germany, Spain, or Italy, the United Kingdom, France, and America all were involved to some degree. And although what would become the Allies during World War II had said we were not going to intervene, we have a non-intervention pact, we saw the fascists intervening, and so their own citizens decided, like these men, to go and fight. So this caused a real problem in the international community because it had this non-intervention pact, which ostensibly banned this. So at the end of 1937, what happened is the League of Nations negotiated the withdrawal of the Lincoln Brigades, who at this point had been fairly decimated in terms of their numbers. I mean, the Americans, 3,500, I don't think half of them survived the war to come home. And more broadly, for the whole international movement, which is about 35,000, similar figures, just appalling losses in some cases. So the League of Nations negotiated a withdrawal. And part of that was, sort of repatriation of these people to the broken loss. A number of people did serve in World War II and died. Gardner died in France. There was another man who died in the Pacific, and his was a big controversy because he had died doing something quite heroic. It had to do with taking out a Japanese machine gun nest on a beach that they were storming. And he really should have gotten some kind of medal for this. Completely whitewashed because he was communist. So, yeah, fighting World War II was not particularly uncommon.
Yeah, Fletcher, I was going to ask, how did some of these individuals fare through the McCarthy era? Did you find any of that information?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, a lot of them sort of went underground. There were a number. It was really hard. I honestly can't speak to this a lot from the Minnesota experience, simply because I was more focused on Wyoming. This is another area which I'd like to expand my research. But I can say for the national movement, you have the same sort of withdrawal from politics, particularly after Stalin's revelations. And they try to lay low. A couple very high-profile cases. Alda Bessie was dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee and was interrogated as part of the Hollywood 10. He was one of those Hollywood writers who were blacklisted as part of having communist connections. So that's one of the highest profile cases of people who suffered under the McCarthy era.
Do you want to talk about, or can you talk about the challenges of you were researching a topic about Minnesota that also had, that was also a national topic, but you sort of had to fit in with the Minnesota story with the national story.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a challenge. Perhaps not in the way that Minnesota challenged the national experience, but more than it sort of just like a microcosm of it. Nothing really stands out to me except the ethnic dimension, where you had a lot of Finns. That was true also of Michigan volunteers, because there was a substantial Finnish population there as well. But, I mean, nationally, you don't see those ethnic dynamics in all states. I tried to deal with some of those issues in the beginning, but I think what I ended up doing is saying, no one has looked at this before. I mean, this is completely new. So this is just a story that needs to be told. And it needs to be put in the context of the national experience as well. But what really stands out about this research is the story. It's it's those individual incidents and those funny little moments, and putting this together and bringing this out into the light where they haven't been seen for the last 70 years.
Is it any accident that, I think most of the people you mentioned, they essentially come from countries right bordering the Soviet Union?
Yeah, that is more of a factor of the immigration dynamics at the time. obviously, early American history, you see a lot of waspish immigration, white Anglo-Saxons. And then as the 19th century progresses, you turn south and you turn east into Italy, Southern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, Eastern Europe generally. By 1900 through 1915 or so, when most of these people immigrated, who would come, or their parents had immigrated at the time, it really lines up well with the curve you see for Minnesota migration from those particular areas. There's a great book that the Historical Society has put out. I can't remember the title exactly, but it's just a big compendium of immigration in Minnesota, and it looks at each ethnic group and tracks the numbers, how many came at what point, and also talks about their experience in the state. So that's where I got a lot of that context of putting that together.
I know that the groups that you're looking at were really dealing with the issue of class inequalities and so on. But you showed a picture of one of the persons you studied with Langston Hughes.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, was at what level might there have been any connection with seeking racial equality?
There was actually a lot. Racism was one of the things that a lot of these men identified as a significant issue for why they felt like they should align themselves with communism. They saw communism as an anti-racial philosophy. There's no place for racism because the fight fundamentally is about fighting the capitalists, and it's from capitalism that you get these sort of racial dynamics. So there were a number of black volunteers, about 80 or so, mostly from the South. Zlotowski, as I had said, was one Minnesotan who, for him, racism was a big deal. And in general, you have to put this in the context of the time as well, because the Popular Front, as we probably see now, propaganda, was constantly drilling the U.S. on you say you're a society of freedom with liberty and equality for all, but look at yourselves. You're lynching black men. You're engaging in all sorts of economic injustice. The sharecropping system in the South is huge at this point in history, where you basically see the same structural relationships of black and white continue from slavery, just without the legalization of slavery. So that propaganda really played a big part of this in these men, who were at the bottom of society. I mean, they were the dregs. They had no jobs, they had no families, they had no finances. A lot of them didn't even have a permanent home. They were constantly moving around. So I think they really identified with ethnic minorities and seeing that they also were subject to this persecution as well. All right, well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all.